Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us here this evening. We have about 40 people online at the moment as well in your virtual community, as well as the people sitting here. So thanks for coming and thanks for watching on the live stream. My name's Jeff. I've recently joined the Comms and Engagement team at DIPD. So I'll just be letting you know how the session will run tonight. Tonight we'll hear from 3 speakers. In a moment we'll have a brief introduction from a member of the State Planning Commission, Mr Craig Holden, who's here. We'll then have detailed presentation from Jason Bailey from DIPD, followed by Jason Katnar from DIPD, who will run through how some of the testing has worked with this phase 1, which is really a pilot version of the code so far. Finally, we'll end up with about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So please send your questions in via the live stream. If you're not here, apparently there is a speech bubble around here somewhere. So please do that. Right, Craig Holden from the State Planning Commission. Craig's career encompasses about 40 years in architecture, property development and building construction in South Australia. He's a director of Form Projects, a multi-award-winning property development company specialising in inner city renewal, which is, of course, a growth industry. He's also a former executive member of the UDIA, a member of the Property Council here in South Australia, and a board member of the ACH Group. Craig's career has naturally provided him considerable hands-on experience and interaction with the planning system, and positions him ideally to understand the importance of changes that are coming in, such as the code. So he's in a great place to introduce tonight's session. So without any further delay, thank you, Craig.
Thank you, and welcome everybody here and everybody out there. We're looking to do more sessions like this to ensure access for as many people as possible. And shortly after this session, the recording will be available to watch on demand for those who've missed it tonight. The release of the Phase 1 code is significant for the Commission and for the Department. I'd like to acknowledge the team, the 2 Jasons here tonight, for all of the significant work that they're doing. It's an enormous task, and everybody's working really hard to deliver this code. There's less than 18 months to go, isn't that right? Is it 15, 14? It's like a quick countdown. It's taken everybody a long time to get their heads around the mechanics of the new tools that you're going to hear about, and I'd like to think all those have been grappling with this for the last year or more. We're excited to bring you all the Phase 2 and 3 draft codes in the coming weeks as well, and there's greater visibility opportunity for everyone to get involved in the conversation and the consultation, which is really important. The feedback is vital from everybody that's out there participating, particularly in Phase 1 of the code, because that impacts our country councils and planners and practitioners. Releasing the code in 3 stages is an exercise in risk mitigation too, because the first code, as mentioned, is a pilot, and it'll enable us to test it and to manage the changes for future phases as we work through. We receive about 50 to 60 applications in the Outback a year, which are managed by the state government. And so we use and learn more. We'll bring these learnings to the broader practitioner community as we get this feedback. The investigations and creation of Phase 1 code represents the first effort in 10 years where we have focused our investment and time in the Outback, which is really important for those who are practitioners in the Outback. We know it isn't perfect, and we're looking to the practitioner community in particular to get this feedback. It's really important, and I stress part of the code is about community consultation. It's a vital part of it, so we rely on your feedback to assist Jason and his team. If you haven't seen it already, we ask that the practitioners use the submission template that's to provide your comments. This will help us immensely in processing comments and hopefully when submitting feedback. So I'll now hand over to Jason, and with no further ado, you're going to hear all about it. So thank you, and do listen and do respond, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. Good evening, everyone. As mentioned, my name's Jason Bailey. I lead the Department of Planning, Transport and Infrastructure's Planning and Design Code team. And I'm here tonight to talk about the draft Outback Code that was released on the 5th of February by the Commission. Now, let's work out how to get this PowerPoint rolling. I'm not going to talk at length about the policy settings within the draft Outback Code. Rather, I'm going to attempt to help you understand how to use it, how the structure, or how it's structured, how it's meant to work. And through that, through helping you understand that, I hope to equip you with what you need to review the policy settings, perhaps in your own time or on your employer's time. That I think is the best way to help you, help us in the way that Craig spoke of, possibly by giving us a submission, attending to some of the policy settings, perhaps the mechanics as well. It's important to note that with the draft Outback Code, the release of it, we're looking to leave sort of behind us, for the most part, the structural, mechanical considerations that come with the task of creating the code. We want to leave them behind us and focus very much on the future, on policy settings. As mentioned, we've got some policy settings for the Outback, of course, in the draft Outback Code. And we're furiously at work on the policy settings for the second and third releases of the code to come in the remainder of this year and the first half of next year, those being for regional South Australia and Greater Adelaide respectively. Now, in focusing on structure of the code, the draft Outback Code and the mechanics of the draft Outback Code, I know that some of you would have heard quite a bit of what I'm going to talk to tonight. I hope some of you wouldn't have, so I think that's a good thing for them, but for those of you that have heard some of what I would speak to tonight, I ask your patience. There is some new information about mechanics in this presentation that if you have seen these sorts of presentations before, you wouldn't have seen before, and that information is really important. Important to understanding how the code's to work, and therefore should be really useful to you in reviewing the draft Outback Code. One final point before I launch into the detail. This content, talking and presenting the mechanics and some of the structural features of the code, is actually a really tricky subject to present on. So I say that to perhaps ask some of your patience with this as well, but also perhaps in support of that contention, I just put in your minds, like, consider when you first were exposed to development plans, and how you came to understand how they worked. I think I would venture for most of us that process took quite a bit of time and was helped along by people that you worked with ultimately, other planners, other practitioners in the industry. It didn't come from reading anything or being shown a PowerPoint. So yeah, please keep that in mind. I think really another point I'm trying to get across there is that this will take time for us all. I know it's certainly taken time for us, and Craig touched on that. We have been at work on the mechanics of structure for a good long time. But yeah, you will get there, and hopefully I'll give you some keys to get you there faster. So, moving on, like a presentation and talking about the structure and mechanics, how the code, the draft Outback Code works, has to begin with just quickly touching on what the Planning, Development and Infrastructure Act says the code must do. What the Act says the code must do is, or includes, the Act says that the code must comprise, or it will comprise zones, subzones and overlays. The Act provides that policy within the code will comprise performance outcomes and deemed to satisfy requirements. The Act establishes the assessment pathways that the code must work with. Something I'll spend quite a bit of time on tonight. The Act provides that the code can establish public notification triggers, something I'll also talk to tonight. And finally, for this sort of overview, the Act provides that the code must be, or ought to be delivered digitally. And that's something to bear in mind as I go along. It's a driving force behind a good part of how the code has been structured and how it's intended to work. So how was that direction given by the Act taken up by the Commission, and how did that direction manifest in the draft Outback code that's now in consultation? The contents page for the draft Outback code begins to reveal that. The contents page reveals that the code has 9 parts. I'm going to talk to all of these briefly, save the 9th part, which is a part to record and document amendments to the code. You'll appreciate no need to do that today. That's premature. We're not quite there yet. Before I keep going, it's important to note that considering the code in this way, looking at its contents page, we won't be doing that for the most part in the future when the e-planning solution comes along and helps us use the code. At its heart, the e-planning solution is going to help us extract from the code the information and the policy that's relevant to the task or the query we have at hand, and that alone. You won't need to flick through the code like a book, like this contents page might suggest you will be. It's important to keep in mind. It's going to make it so much easier. So, part 1, briefly, rules of interpretation. This part of the code, the draft Outback Code and Consultation, articulates some of the rules, some of the ways the code should work that aren't explicitly articulated in the Planning Development Infrastructure Act, or for that matter, draft regulations and regulations that exist at the moment. The Commission and the Department have advice to the effect that the code can do this, the code can go here. The code can, in a sense, tell itself and tell us how it's to be used and how it's not to be used in certain ways. Of course, these instructions can't be at odds with what the Act provides, or the regulations for that matter. But I think it's fair to say that the Act and the regulations leave quite a bit silent in this respect. It's not a criticism, it's just, I think, an observation, and that silence is there for the code to fill. Now, some of the rules of interpretation and usage within this first part are pretty mundane, pretty straightforward. For instance, there's a rule about how punctuation marks are to be interpreted. The favourite of planners, semicolons and the and or the or. There's some rules about that sort of thing in this first part. But there's some really some juicy rules in this first part as well. For instance, including how desired outcomes are to be used in assessment. Desired outcomes happen to be a policy that the Act doesn't explicitly contemplate be a part of the code. And it has been a question, how are these to be used in an assessment context? This first part of the code articulates how the Commission sees that they'll be used. Rules within this part of the code take on some statutory force by being a part of the code. That's the real value of putting rules and instructions as to how to use the code in this part of the code. We won't be able to ignore it. Final point on this part, you can expect it to be added to. I with practice and with usage and sort of real life testing of the code, it's inevitable that we'll find things that we ought articulate rules for. And a lot of those, or perhaps at least some of those, it's envisaged will come into this first part of the code and be there available, not in the regulations for you and us to sift through and try and find. Moving on, parts 2 to 4. These are really the heart and soul of the draft Outback code. They're the zones, the subzones, the overlays and the general modules. Part 2 contains the zones proposed for the Outback within the draft Outback code. It doesn't contain any subzones. They're not seen to be needed for the Outback. The policy environment in the Outback isn't that complex. A few quick points on zones. Zones will be the heavy lifters within the code. They'll direct the important procedural tasks that must be taken in an assessment context. And I'm going to talk about those as I go forward. Zones contain policy about land use and built form. There's been an effort to confine policy content within zones to those matters. And there happens to be 7 zones in the draft Outback code. I won't go through those name by name. I'll allow you to have a look at them with the benefit of what I'm talking about tonight. Part 3 contains the overlays. Overlays relate to issues that are spatial in nature and that are either of a state level interest or that have an assessment procedure consequence. By state level interest, I mean the subjects of state planning policies in a nutshell, for the most part. By assessment procedure consequences, I mean something like a referral trigger, or possibly a need to change an assessment pathway for a development type. A dwelling may be deemed to satisfy in some zones, but should it be deemed to satisfy if a high bushfire risk overlay applies? As their name suggests, overlays will lie over the top of zones, subzones, and for the most part they'll add policy to the policy that a zone and a subzone gives us for a particular development type. They'll also, to repeat myself, possibly change procedural matters for a development type. Within the draft Outback code there are 19 overlays in total. Herein is a big, I think, shift from what we're used to in development plans and the current system. The number of overlays that we're on the path towards having in the code for all of South Australia. Already we're at 19 in the Outback proposed. By the time the code comes to cover all of South Australia, to be honest, I don't know exactly how many there will be, but there'll be quite a few more than 19. This reflects a really important feature of the way in which the code is heading, and that is it's about specificity of policy. And if policy is spatial in nature, let's target it to the space that it applies to. And you do that through overlays. You do that to a lesser extent through zones. You don't do it in general modules like exist in development plans at the moment, and leave to planners and anyone for that matter some discretion and some sort of judgment as to, might this policy be relevant to the site that I'm interested in? Don't know. Final point on overlays, most of the proposed triggers for referral of development to state agencies are within overlays. That's because most of them are spatial in nature, and we've been able to locate them logically within overlays. Part 4 of the code contains the modules of general development policies. There are 20 of these in total in the draft Outback Code. They contain policies about what we call functional matters. How should private open space for a dwelling be configured? How many car park spaces should some land use be supplied with? Those sorts of things. They don't contain, or made an effort not to see them contain, land use and built form policy. The majority of the general development modules concern particular development types. So for instance, there's a general module for advertisements. There's a general module for intensive animal keeping. There's actually two for intensive animal keeping. There's a general module for waste treatment and management facilities. That's a product of our effort to see general development policies run with land use types. There are 6 exceptions to the rule that is that general modules should be about particular land uses. We've got a general module for clearance from overhead power lines, design and siting, interface between land uses, residential livability, site contamination, and transport access and parking. We have those simply to avoid the need to repeating those sorts of functional kinds of policies across so many zones. Site contamination perhaps is a good example. If it weren't for the general module on site contamination, we'd arguably have to put site contamination policy in every zone that exists within the code. Despite that there are quite a number of general modules, I'd sort of throw in that e-planning in time will help us extract from the general modules what we need when we need it, and that alone. Part 5 of the draft Outback Code, mapping. This is a part for and to contain maps. Those of you that have had a chance to download the draft Outback Code and flick through it, you would have perhaps got to this part and noted there's no maps there. Rather, there's a hyperlink to a web-based mapping portal or map viewer. That web-based map viewer is essentially a forerunner to the online atlas. The Planning Development Infrastructure Act requires or establishes that there will be an online atlas. And the atlas will be a key part of the new planning system, and it will be the source of all spatial information that we use in assessment. All of the zone sort of boundaries, the overlay boundaries, the subzone boundaries, and so on. It can contain, the online atlas can perhaps not be confined to that sort of information to help us do what we need to do. We are currently exploring a move away from having any of the old-fashioned grid-based mapping that currently exists within development plans, and relying perhaps almost exclusively on the online atlas or the digital mapping tools that will include the online atlas. You'll appreciate if we don't do that, and we continue to have to produce grid-based mapping, and this time across the whole estate for things like the however many overlays we end up with at the end of this transition process to the code, the pile of maps will be very, very high. You cannot, quite simply, have all 20 or all 19 of the overlay maps that are in the draft Outback Code on one representation. It will be senseless. Where there might be some part of the Outback over which there could be, theoretically all 19 overlays applying. Won't work. So that's something we're exploring at the moment. We will be publishing soon on the portal grid-based maps for the draft Outback code, but I say again, we're exploring whether in fact we need to continue doing that, recognising that the digital approach would be better for us all. Part 6 and 7, definitions. The Planning Development Infrastructure Act says that the code will contain definitions. A bit of a change to the way things are done at the moment, where the Development Act isn't so clear about development plans being able to contain definitions. Part 6 is going to contain land use definitions, and sorry, it does contain land use definitions. Part 7 contains what we call administrative definitions. Land use definitions, I don't need to describe what they are, definitions of various dwelling types, that sort of thing. Administrative definitions attend to things like building height and those sorts of terms, which, if not defined, can leave ambiguity in the system that causes some trouble to us all. Don't want to have to be re-prosecuting what building height means over and over again. The definitions that are in the draft Outback Code have really been kept to those that are needed for development control in the Outback. The definitions will be augmented in the coming iterations of the code for regional South Australia and Greater Adelaide. Put simply, yeah, definitions that aren't needed in the Outback are not in the draft Outback Code. So some definitions for sort of multi-storey building types, that sort of thing, you won't find in the draft Outback Code. There is some change to the definitions within the draft Outback Code to those that exist at the moment. Some refinement. There's also a different approach taken to the definitions with the inclusion of a column or a space to define to articulate what a definition doesn't include. It's a simple thing, but we hope and expect it's going to help us a lot in making very clear and unambiguous what a definition entails, what it means. Part 8, the last part I'm going to talk to, referrals. This part contains the balance of referrals. I mentioned earlier that the majority of referrals are in the overlays within the code because they're spatial in nature. Coastal development, for example, in coastal areas. The referrals in this part are not spatial in nature. They're purely land use based. They're really about, for the most part, EPA's referrals in respect of licensed activities, tanneries, stock slaughter works, this sort of stuff. No matter where you propose a tannery, you're going to trigger a referral to the EPA. So we couldn't put that referral into an overlay. So this is, just a place for those statewide referral triggers. So that's a brief intro and description of the various parts of the code. Now to getting into how to use it, how to use the code. So this part of my presentation, it focuses on using it for assessment, really, or a detailed query where you have, or one has, a location and a development type in mind, and one wants to know how the code treats that combination of variables. Using the code in the most sort of powerful, detailed way hinges on having a development type and a location. There's no change here, though. The current system's like that. To really sort of get to the bottom of what the development plan means for something, you need a location, you need a development type. Location, it won't come as a surprise, is going to dictate what zone is relevant, noting that every square centimetre of the state is in a zone, including coastal waters that a lot of them at the moment aren't in a zone. We've brought them into a zone in the draft Outback Code. Location also, of course, is going to dictate whether a subzone is relevant and an overlay is relevant. They'll both be defined spatially. Now you have to move to development type. And bringing in development type allows us to classify the assessment pathway. And I'm going to try and put emphasis on that word classify because it's important in the context, as I'll sort of try to make clear. Having a development type also allows you to determine what policies from the code are relevant. It's also going to allow you to determine whether public notification is triggered and whether any referrals are triggered, of course. So you got those two variables, then you make a beeline for the zone. Zones are the central organiser in the code. Not to play favourites, they're the most important part of the code. Reason being, they do the heavy lifting on determining assessment procedure. And that's because zones alone, classify development through a tool I'm about to talk about. They establish requirements for accepted development. They establish requirements for deemed to satisfy development. They identify relevant policies for performance assessed development and restricted development. And they set out public notification triggers. Let's look at that in a bit more detail. Firstly, by just recapping on the assessment pathways. The Act creates 4 core assessment pathways. Exempt development, you don't need approval at all. Planning, building, you don't need it. Accepted development, you don't need planning approval. You do need building rules consent or building approval. Code assessed development, talk about that in a sec. And impact assessed development, I'll also talk about in a sec. Come back to code assessed development. The Act breaks code assessed development pathway into 2 pathways. The deemed to satisfy pathway, if you qualify for that, if your development location qualifies for that, you're guaranteed an approval. And performance assessed development. Planning consent can be refused. It's a merit decision. Quickly on impact assessed development, that gets broken into 3 pathways. Restricted development, of course planning consent can be refused. Impact assessed, identified by the regulations, that's for development types that the regulations are going to say are impact assessed and need be accompanied with an environmental impact statement. Pulp mills maybe, jetties, we'll see. Finally, impact assessed called in by the Minister. The Minister's ability to call things in. We don't need to really be worried with the 2 that I just touched on. We're going to focus on accepted, deemed to satisfy and restricted. The reason we're going to do that is that the Act provides that the code need classify development into the accepted, deemed to satisfy and restricted pathways. It can't, this is where things get a bit technical, the Act provides or does not provide for the code classifying development into the performance assessed pathway. The performance assessed pathway is a default pathway. If a development type isn't classified as either accepted, deemed to satisfy or restricted, it defaults into performance assessment. Or if a development that could be deemed to satisfy but fails to meet one or a number of the requirements that are associated with that, it trips out into performance assessment pathway. Quick note that the Act does not provide for the code being able to classify development into the impact assessed pathways. As mentioned, that's for either the regulations or for the Minister to call in on a case-by-case basis. So drilling in on this business of classification more. To do what the Act says it will do, the code needs, classification tables have been included within the code. For those of you that have seen presentations of this nature through last year, This is a new thing. This actually, it came into the construction or the structure of the code late in our development of it. Now, I mentioned that we've got our location, we've got our development type, we're now sort of looking into the code. What does it mean for these two? I mentioned you're zipping to the zone, you're just going straight to the zone. If you open up a zone in the draft Outback code that's currently available on the SA Planning portal, you get to a zone, first page you have a desired outcome, and then you'll see policies in the form of performance outcomes deemed to satisfy requirements. I'll ask you to keep going, and you'll get, after a few pages, to the first table of a number within every zone, being the classification table. Classification tables, quite simply, do what I was mentioning a minute ago, the act asks of it. They quite simply say development X can be classified or is classified as accepted, development Y classified as deemed to satisfy, development Z classified as restricted. I've got an example from the draft Outback code here on the screen, and this is the first part of the classification table, that for accepted development. So, for instance, in the settlement zone in the draft Outback code, a carport is identified as an accepted development. Now, the classifications tables have an exceptions column, and that column is to identify the circumstances under which a development type can't be accepted or can't be deemed to satisfy. In this case, with a carport, it could, or it would be, if the coastal areas overlay was relevant to the location, relevant to the site, or the hazards, acid sulphate soils overlay. I think perhaps you'll understand the reasons for that are that the presence of certain overlays will mean that risk needs to be assessed, and an assessment is required. Next table within a zone is the requirements for accepted development. Quite a simple table, identifying what requirements need to be met for a development classified as accepted to actually remain and be accepted and not require any approval. So here from the draft Outback code, an excerpt, the settlement zone, carport identified in the table 1 as an accepted kind of development. Here are the requirements that it need meet in order to qualify for that pathway. Rewinding a bit, another example, dwelling addition, classified in the settlement zone in the draft Outback code as a deemed to satisfy development. So this is, I'm back in table 1, but in the next section of it, where the table's gone to deemed to satisfy development. Then it goes to restricted. We've got the exceptions there as well for a dwelling addition, being various overlays again. So now we'll go on to the next major part in how to use the code in an assessment context or with a detailed query, and that's to do with identifying relevant provisions. The third table within each zone identifies deemed to satisfy requirements for development classified earlier as deemed to satisfy. Up on the screen, got an example again from the draft Outback code and the settlement zone. Dwelling addition earlier in the zone identified as a deemed to satisfy development. Table 3 identifies the deemed to satisfy requirements that need be met in order to continue to qualify for that pathway and be guaranteed of planning consent. So, you'll appreciate that the deemed to satisfy requirements identified by this table are the only requirements that can be brought to bear in an assessment. An authority, no matter where they are and who they are, can't add requirements to what the code will provide. Excuse me, I'm going to skip this slide. So, continuing with the identification of relevant policies, but moving now from deemed to satisfy and deemed to satisfy requirements to performance assessed development. The fourth table in each zone identifies relevant provisions within the code for performance assessed development types. This table warrants particular attention. Earlier, I spoke to you about the fact that the code can't classify development into performance assessed pathway. The performance assessed pathway is a default pathway. And that default pathway is activated when you've fallen out of accepted, deemed to satisfy, or you haven't actually, the development type hasn't been classified into either of the development types that can be classified, sorry, the assessment pathways that can be classified. Now, this table, it's not classifying development because, again, the code can't do that. Rather, it's got that single focus of identifying relevant provisions for certain performance assessed development types. This is an important feature in order to get an e-planning system up and running and working for us in the way and to the extent it can. Without something like this, if ever a performance assessed development were proposed, the e-planning solution would be relegated essentially to delivering back to whoever's making the query most of the code with a note saying, hey, talk to your planner or your council or someone about what provisions could potentially be relevant to the development. We don't want that. That's not making the most of the e-planning solution. And that's why we have this table. Importantly, this table, it's not going to identify relevant provisions for all kinds of performance assessed development. Noting that, again, the performance assessed pathway is the default pathway, it's the case that anything that's a bit out of the box, a bit out of left field, that hasn't been classified as accepted, deemed to satisfy, restricted even, it's going to default into the performance assessed pathway. That's a myriad range of development types, infinite perhaps. We're not, and it's a waste of our time to go after every conceivable performance assessed development and populate this table for them. Can't do it. So what's in the draft Outback code and each of the zones and each of these tables within each of the zones is there's been effort to go after envisaged, sort of anticipated, expected development types, performance assessed development types. So the example we've got, settlement zone again, relevant provisions have been identified for development types like advertisements, carports, outbuildings, consulting rooms, offices, things that perhaps can be expected, anticipated in the settlement zone, which happens to be a bit of a mixed use zone, for those of you that might not know. Now, we are aware that there is some concern about this particular part of the code because of what it entails, that being that it is these policies and these policies alone that will be relevant to an assessment of the development or a development they relate to, as opposed to an authority having discretion to go beyond what is identified as relevant in this table. The Commission has been provided and the Department's been provided with advice to the effect that it is within the power of the code to do this. The Act gives the code the power to do this. almost done on identification of relevant provisions. Final table is identification of relevant provisions for restricted kinds of development. This table identifies relevant provisions for restricted kinds of development. Pretty much everything I said about the previous table, the performance assessed relevant provisions table, can be applied to this table. It's the same thing essentially. The one perhaps key difference being that the Act and the practice direction for restricted development provides the State Commission Assessment Panel, which will be the authority for restricted development, to go a bit beyond the code for reasons that might present themselves with an application for restricted development. But this will help all of us identify what provisions are seen to be relevant to a restricted development. That's the wrong slide, isn't it? That's the right slide. So yeah, we've got an example here from the conservation zone with the draft outback, within the draft outback code. Land division, classified as a restricted kind of development in the conservation zone. Here are the provisions that the draft outback code provides are relevant to that. So almost done with the procedure. You're still with me in a zone. You've been through the classification tables. You've been through the relevant provisions tables. You now, to almost complete determination of procedure for a development, have to consider whether the public notification triggers apply. These, again, are within zones in the code, in the draft outback code. Now, the PDI Act provides that all performance assessed development will trigger public notification. The Act goes on, however, to say that the code can exempt performance assessed development from that requirement. Two approaches have been taken in the draft outback code to that ability to exempt. The first, perhaps the obvious one, is to exempt a development type as a whole from a performance assessed development type as a whole from a public notification. The second, an example of which is up on the screen, is to exempt by condition, for want of a better way to put it, that where a performance assessed development doesn't meet a certain condition, which might be a deemed satisfier requirement sort of relevant to that development type, it trips or triggers public notification. The example up there relates to wind farms and where a wind turbine is not located a specified distance from either a non-associated dwelling, tourist accommodation, or a sensitive zone, essentially a settlement, township, etc. zone. Now, to complete procedure, we've got to go away from zones for a moment to either the overlays, if they're relevant, or Part 9 of the code. And that's to determine, referral triggers. I won't dwell on this slide. I think you understand how referral triggers essentially are operating and where they're located. All I say is, again, that when the e-planning solution comes about through this year, we will see that we will be given help on this front in getting referral triggers that are relevant to either a development type or to a particular part of the state within an overlay. Okay, so that's dealing with procedure, and I went to that first because that, I think, is the first place that you should go when you're considering the code, and it'll help you. I hope that account helps you understand how the code works, with going to the back of the zones sort of to begin with, and now, after you've done that and established the procedure, you can come up into the zone and elsewhere in the code to look at the relevant policies themselves and the settings. So now I'm going to talk about the policies. All modules contain policies. Zones contain policies. Overlays contain policies. Subzones will contain policies. General modules contain policies. There was some doubt about whether overlays, for instance, would contain policies. They do. And those of you who've downloaded the draft Outback code would have seen that. The policies take three forms. Desired outcomes, performance outcomes, deemed to satisfy requirements. Strictly speaking, could be argued there's a fourth type, requirements for accepted development, but they're a bit off to the side, so I'm not talking about those as policies tonight. Desired outcomes. Each module, whether it's an overlay, zone, general module, etc., is supported by one. Desired outcomes will concisely outline the vision, the intent of the module that they exist within. They're essentially a role statement. Desired outcomes are going to do some of the work in replacing desired character statements. And in the draft Outback code, we hope that you can see how that, some evidence of that and how it can manifest in the future. Important note, the Act, the PDI Act, doesn't explicitly contemplate desired outcomes, but they're seen to be a useful part of the code. And that's why they're in the draft Outback code. Performance outcomes deemed to satisfy requirements. Performance outcomes, as their name suggests, describe an outcome that need be achieved. They don't, however, set out or mandate how that outcome's to be achieved. Performance assessment revolves around performance outcomes. Deemed to satisfy requirements, on the other hand, central to assessment of deemed to satisfy development. In order to make clear what is expected of deemed to satisfy development, to facilitate that guaranteed approval, deemed to satisfy requirements need to be unambiguous, black and white, measurable. Doesn't mean they need to be quantifiable all the time, they just need to be unambiguous. It's beyond debate. Now I'm going to try and take you through some assessment scenarios that try and bring together all that I've talked about. And I'll do this quickly, I think I've taken a bit too much time. So beginning with the deemed to satisfy development, this time in the remote area zone in the draft Outback code, a dwelling addition. You'll note I'm looking at table 3 on the screen here, which is identifying the requirements for deemed to satisfy development. So with the dwelling addition, this table identifies what requirements from the zone are relevant, what deemed to satisfy requirements from general modules are relevant, whether there's any from subzone that are relevant, whether there are any from overlays that are relevant. Quite simply, they're all to be added together and in effect that becomes the code for that development type. The e-planning solution will deliver that. Some of you will ask, okay, what happens when there's 2 development types within a proposal? The Act calls these elements. So a carport that's detached from a dwelling, an application proposes them both. The carport's an element, the dwelling's an element. An element is not a policy, in case you heard that. An element is a development in its own right. So what happens when you've got 2 of them, say a dwelling addition and excavation and filling in a remote area zone in the draft Outback code in this instance? You simply add the policies together. It's that simple, and the e-planning solution will do that for us too. Now, the code helps us. It's got some tricks up its sleeve, including giving us the ability to switch policy on and off. So, imagine excavation and filling that's development is proposed in the remote area zone in the Outback. It happens to be the case that no policies from the zone are relevant to that. A policy from the design, the siting general module is relevant. No subzones relevant. But if there's an overlay that's relevant, and it's the sloping land overlay, within the sloping land overlay is policy that's different to the general module design and siding earthworks policy. The code gives us the ability to replace that general module policy with, the overlay policy. Another thing that will be delivered to us by the e-planning solution. We'll be programming all of this in to the e-planning solution. Okay, development types that have tripped in. Imagine a dwelling addition. Again, remote area zone. We get the policies from the zone, we get the policies from the general modules. No policies from the subzone because there aren't any. If the state heritage place overlay is relevant, what I meant by tripped in is that fact alone might see the dwelling addition fall out of deemed to satisfy and trip into the performance assessment pathway. That's accommodated by the draft Outback code, and you'll see that in the tables in the zones. Finally, touching on something I talked about earlier, development type's not listed, a performance assessed development type. What happens then? Quite simply, the code had written into it an instruction that gives an authority the ability, to consider all of its content and identify what the relevant provisions are at its discretion. Of course, it doesn't mean that authority can go into other zones. It'll be confined to the relevant zone. But when it comes to, it's got the whole of the general module set available to it. Yeah, be confined to only overlays that are relevant. Yeah. Okay, this is a slide that seeks to convey what happens if a deemed to satisfy development does not meet one of the deemed to satisfy requirements that has been identified as relevant to it by the code. If a deemed to satisfy development meets all the deemed to satisfy requirements, it's guaranteed an approval. It must be granted planning consent. An authority can't stand in the way of that. If it doesn't meet one or more of those requirements, however, there's quite simply a change of pathway, and that development type falls into the performance assessment pathway, and the authority is given power to make a decision on merit. Now, when this happens, we would see that the authority would still give regard to the deemed to satisfy requirement that's not being met. It's logical, it's sensible. That has been written into part 1 of the draft Outback code. So to illustrate how that works, looking at a zone, proposed for a dwelling addition, remote area zone, comes up against a deemed to satisfy requirement regarding height of 9 metres. If that building doesn't exceed 9 metres, it gets a tick against that deemed to satisfy requirement. If it's satisfying all other relevant deemed to satisfy requirements, it gets approved, full stop. If, however, that dwelling addition was not meeting that particular deemed to satisfy requirement about height, the pathway is changed and an authority is empowered to go into this left-hand column of policy, being the performance outcomes, to guide its ultimate decision. As mentioned, if the performance outcome is satisfied, if the authority finds that the proposal is nevertheless meeting the performance outcome despite not meeting the deemed to satisfy requirement, the development can be approved. Now finally, performance assessed pathway, a wind farm. With a performance assessed pathway and a performance assessed development, you essentially begin on that left-hand side column of policy. But where there is a deemed to satisfy requirement complementing a performance outcome, separation distance in this instance for wind turbines, the authority should accept that give it regard. Another example there. It then falls to the authority to consider the performance outcomes that don't have complementary deemed to satisfy requirements. It's within the discretion, within the power of the authority to find that the proposal does meet those. Where there's some doubt about a proposal meeting a performance outcome and a judgment's required, the first part of the code points the authority to the desired outcome. That's where we see desired outcomes assisting and perhaps helping with that final judgment. So that's what I'm going to cover tonight. In summary, I've tried to convey to you that using the draft Outback code and understanding how it works, it begins with you focusing on procedure, and you do that by going to a zone and going to the sort of the tail end of the zone to classify the development in the first instance, or see what the classifications are, to have a look at the way in which that draft Outback code is identifying relevant policies for development types. You might disagree with what's in that. You might think there are gaps here or there. Then you go to public notification triggers and referral triggers. I do hope that helps you access, consider the code. I think if you just get it as a PDF and open it up, you might be like, where do I start? That's what I've tried to focus on to help. Next steps going forward, we know that there is a lot of refinement to the policy content that can be affected, whether it's the performance outcomes or the deemed satisfy requirements, to make sure the deemed satisfy requirements are unambiguous, black and white. We've got some work to do, and it's great that you're going to help us with that. I've banged on enough about the e-planning system coming along to help us in time. I really look forward to that. It's actually, yeah, it's going to be interesting and exciting. Testing is underway. I'm going to hand over to Jason Katanar. He's going to talk to it. Thank you.
Okay. Hi everyone. If you haven't met me before, I'm Jason Katanar. I'm Unit Manager for Development Assessment, so working on primarily the business as usual, but supporting the team working on reforms. And now's been a crucial time in our role in the department in trying to support the reforms program. We've, since in the last few weeks and the first iteration of the Outback code, been active in doing some live testing of the code. It's important to people doing testing at this point to go back to the sources of truth. So the sources of truth that I refer to are the Act, the regulations and the P&D code. And the reason why that's critically important are twofold. Number one, we don't have the planning solution in place as yet. That's being developed. As Jason's talked about numerous times, once that is in place, it'll do a lot of the grunt work in trying to filter through the code and work out the assessment pathways and a lot of the stuff that the Act and Regs and P&D code too. The other is that, as you'd all be aware, when you've been doing planning for a long time, you often default to your assumed knowledge or remembered knowledge of what something says in the Act or what something says in the regulations. It's easy to fall into that pattern of behaviour. So it's a timely reminder to get back to those sources of truth and make sure that we fully understand what they say. And it's important to know where to find the answer. It's more important than thinking you know the answer in your own mind. So we've kept that central to our testing. In our early iterations of the testing, we haven't been looking specifically at the policy content. It's difficult to sort of pull back the reins a little bit because we are excited about getting into, well, what does that DTS criteria actually say? What does that performance outcome actually say? Is it ambiguous? Is it clear? So we've pulled the reins back on that. And we're really looking at the testing at a higher level. Firstly, in terms of the definitions, is there a definition in the code? is the definition contradicted somewhere else in the code? Does the definition support the policy intent? And that's also critically important. The assessment pathway, is that clear? The timeframes, are we confident that we can refer back to the regulations and distill what the actual timeframe is for the assessment, which will be critically important again because we have deemed consents. So as relevant authorities, it will be extremely important to identify that timeframe early on and that it's clear and unambiguous. Relevant authority or relevant authorities, again, depending on whether it's performance assessed or deemed to satisfy, there could be multiple authorities that can potentially approve a particular development. Public notification, again, who needs to be notified, what developments need to be notified. Looking at the zone, subzone and overlays, are they clear? Again, when assigning a generic land use, can you find out what the zones, subzones and overlays are? And referrals, again, applying the overlays, is it clear where there's a referral triggered? So they've been sort of the high level elements that we've been looking at through our testing. This is effectively the template that we have been using. It's not anything overly technical, but it captures all the relevant information that I referred to in the last slide, which are what we see to be the important high-level components of the testing at this point. So to take the first example for an outbuilding, is there a definition in the code? No, there's not. So the code instructs you, as Jason was talking about earlier through its notes section, what to do in a situation where there isn't a definition in the code, and the default source there is the Macquarie Dictionary. Assessment pathway and outbuilding, again as a generic land use, could be performance assessed, it could be deemed to satisfy, it could be accepted development. So again, looking at relevant authorities, it could be an assessment manager or an accredited professional, level 3 or a level 4. So again, this is the trick to the testing at the moment. Once you start delving into the specificity of a development, so is the outbuilding 60 square metres in size, is it 80 square metres in size, is it 3 metres tall, is it 5 metres tall, opens up a whole can of worms that we'll be looking at in the next step of our testing, but at the moment it's really just looking at that high level. And from that you can get those kind of core elements of what the assessment pathway would be. Public notification, outbuildings no. Zone remote areas, so that's the zone that we applied to this generic testing. Zone policies, yes, there are relevant zone policies. There's no subzone, no overlays, and general policies, yes, there are provisions in the general section. Referrals for this instance here, there were none. What we'll be doing with this is providing that to practitioners through the portal and through Council Connect. We also have some instructions on how to actually use the testing template. So we'd very much encourage everyone to get involved and provide their input. If you, for some reason, decide that there's a better way to actually present some of your testing, happy to see that, happy to receive that. Whatever you feel is going to best position you to articulate your findings to us so that we can factor that into the code development is all going to be very worthwhile. So from our testing, what are the things that we've liked? We've found that the assessment pathway is clear. Again, that's different from the relevant, who potentially could be a relevant authority again in the outbuilding example. But again, that's getting down to the kind of specific size of that outbuilding example and the policy content. But very much so the assessment pathway is clear, which is an important feature of the code. There's certainty in regard to public notification. So thinking back to the current system which we have, not everything is categorised in the development plan, not everything's captured in Schedule 9, Part 1 or Part 2. And there's always that subjectivity around Part 9 2G. It eliminates that uncertainty and those potential scenarios where you're unsure as the person doing the assessment, do I err on the side of caution and go Category 3, or do I, just bite the bullet and be courageous and do Category 1? So all of that sort of risk around public consultation is eliminated through this. Agency referrals are clear. Again, going back to the overlays, once they're applied in that spatial layer, it's very clear to be able to click on a property and it comes up with all the relevant information about whether or not a referral is triggered. Deemed satisfied criteria are linked to a specific performance outcome. Again, that's what we see as being a really important and useful feature of the code. It eliminates those scenarios where in current development plans you have objectives and then you have principles of development control, not just in the zone but also in the policy area and also in the general section, and you're forever trying to work through that whole development plan, trying to work out what's actually relevant, what principles of development control actually link back into objectives. Eliminates all of that hard work into directly linking the DTS requirements with the performance outcomes. What can be improved? The code's clearly a document that works best in an e-planning solution. And I'll say that in part actually feeling quite happy that we're doing the testing without the e-planning solution developed. It gets back to the point that I initially raised about getting back to the sources of truth and not getting into a lazy mindset where you're letting systems or letting acquired knowledge lead you into assumed decision making. So it means that you actually need to get back into the code, work through its structure, flick back and forth. I look at e-planning and kind of liken that to books before indexing was created, or current PDF documents before hyperlinks were created. The e-planning solution will effectively be that indexing to help you work through the code and get to the relevant sections of the code that you need to be quickly and efficiently so that you can perform your assessment work. The policy content needs to be refined. As Jason alluded to, the code is very much a test document in the Outback. We've distilled it to what we feel are the important pieces of policy and the ones that do lots of work in the Outback. Of course, that policy is not going to do all the work in the metro area, and so the work needs to be done in that. So through your testing, again, we'd sort of urge you to keep the testing at the high level. You'll no doubt want to get stuck into the policy, and certainly we're quite happy for you to get stuck into the policy, because earlier that you can start thinking about how the policy is actually working, whether there are any conflicts in the policy or any of the definitions, the earlier you can then start informing your feedback when we start phase 2, phase 3 of the code and start going out for broader consultation. So yeah, definitely if you can get involved, the resources will be online in the coming days. And take to the next slide. The templates testing tools will be available on the portal, Council Connect. It's important to comment on what can be improved, coupled with what works well. Think about yourself learning and how you best respond to improving as a professional. It's important to understand the things you're doing well, what's working well in the code for us, what needs to be tweaked a little bit. So it's important to get both those bits of feedback. And lastly, we're happy to receive emails and phone calls to answer questions, even if it's just to shoot the breeze and talk in conceptual words around ideas and things that could or may not work well in the code. So please reach out to us. We're happy to have that conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Craig. We're over to question time, and we've got about 10 minutes for questions. And Carmela at the back is waving at me furiously. Is that because you've got a question?
Yes. Can you turn this microphone on? Yes, we've got a question from Scott at Prospect Council for Jason Bailey. So, if you want to move up the microphone. Is it possible to make available the advice that the Commission has received confirming that the code can restrict which provisions are relevant provisions for the purposes of section 102, bracket 1, bracket A, bracket I? The head clause of section 102 appears to match the current related provision of the Development Act, and this advice does not appear to match the operation of the Development Act. We remain concerned that the Erd Court may overturn a decision made by a relevant authority on the basis that one or more relevant provisions were not considered during an assessment as a result of them not appearing in the table, and that was to do with Table 4, performance assessed.
Thank you for the question. Can I be heard? Look, you'll appreciate I can't make a decision to release that advice. All I share with you is that, yeah, there is advice. Stand up, I'm being told. No doubt this will be something that gets considered and is the subject of dialogue going forward. I know it's a really significant matter, one that understandably is a bit of a focus for local government authorities. But I would say that, and this isn't to sort of kick this can down the road, that I would say that with the operation of the new system are going to come all sorts of learnings and identification of things that need to be clarified, improved. I don't say that to say that we're going to kick that down all the way to operation, but it may be that we do wait for operation to occur to see what actually happens on that front. And I'll just close by saying, with the pilot's great for this purpose. It will shed some light on how this is going to work.
I've got one more question from Mark at Wattle Range Council. Phase 1 versus Phase 2. Will each phase replace the existing phase?
Yes. And so that's really good too, because we have that opportunity. We get 2 bites at the Phase 1 policy, essentially. It's not to say that we want to go back and continue going back over work that's done. I hope, and I know I strive, and my team strives, and we all strive to get the policy as good as it can be first up. But yeah, the short answer is yes, we can go back over it.
Okay, does anybody in the room have a question? Don't all rush. Yep. Jeff, thank you.
Hi Jason. Jeff from URPS. Who's made the decision on table 4 for relevant provisions for performance assessed work?
As in who has decided how to populate it?
Yeah.
The department put a proposal together and provided that to the Commission, and the Commission's endorsed it. Is that answering your question, Jeff?
Well, somebody must have made the decision on what relevant provisions are going to apply, so that what you're saying, the department put that together and then the Commission signed off on it.
That's right. And that's something that would be, we really value comment on that, because it is so important. I know I'd like to think that it is within our ability, like as a practitioner community, to identify what provisions should be relevant to a development type. There will be, I know, scenarios at the margins where there might be some gaps, but I think for 99-point-something% of the time, we as a practitioner community and perhaps the community more broadly can come to an agreement essentially on what is relevant when.
Any more questions in the room?
Yeah, hi Jason, Glenn here from Mowbridge Council. Just following on from Jeff's question, so when it comes to phase 2 and 3 in regards to those criteria, those performance outcomes, you said with obviously out of councils there's no council there to decide, to give comment on those provisions, so the Commission decided. How much input will councils have with those provisions when it comes to phase 2 and 3? Will it be a top-down Commission-led, these are the provisions, deal with it councils, or will there be, because obviously you're smashing umpteen number of development plans together and saying, all of these, for say, residential zone provisions from all these different councils, you've got to combine them into one zone or a number of zones. So who leads that?
The Commission is leading it, and that has been the subject of an announcement. Now to get to the phase 2 code and that point that you described, certainly the department will be looking to work with local government to identify, you know, what provision should be relevant, what the performance outcomes should be, or all of that stuff. There is more to come from the department very soon on how we see that happening, imminently, essentially. And if you perhaps, yeah, watch this space, Glenn. We're very close to sharing more of that with local government.
Any more questions? Anything else from online, Camilla? No? All right. Well, that might be it, ladies and gentlemen. Please thank Jason, and Craig again for their time. And just in closing, just want to reinforce what everyone here has said tonight, that this consultation is genuine, and in fact it's probably more than consultation. We're looking for collaboration on making this work. So don't hesitate to get onto the phone to the guys, to make submissions, to actually get in now, and that process will continue through phase 1 and 2, through phase 2 and 3, sorry, as we go on, and it will be a genuine collaboration and consultation. So thank you all. Cheers.